Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started, and I'm just going to introduce Dr. Lonnie Zwagenbaum, who's going to be welcoming everybody to today's conference and also doing a little bit of a talk on autism research in the last year. Dr. Lonnie Zwagenbaum is the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation Chair in Autism Research and is a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta. He directs the Autism Research Center based at Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital. Dr. Zwagenbaum's research focuses on early behavior and biological markers and developmental trajectories in children and youth with autism spectrum disorders. He holds several national and international leadership roles in ASD research. Dr. Zwagenbaum is the program director of the National Autism Research Training Program, responsible for training and mentoring the next generation of ASD researchers in Canada. He is also project lead on the Kids Brain Health Network, ASD Research Stream, and a former vice president of the International Society for Autism Research. Dr. Zwagenbaum is the chair of the Baby Siblings Research Consortium Executive Committee and directs one of two Canadian sites of the Autism Speaks Autism Treatment Network. Dr. Zwagenbaum was awarded a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Award in 2013 to recognize his contributions to autism research and clinical care. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lonnie Zwagenbaum.
Wow, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Sana. Thank you, all of you, for making it here this morning through this wonderful weather. I have to say, I was driving in and trying to remember, so is this like the last day of summer or the first day of fall? And Annette Specht, who's the admin support to the Research Center, kind of reminded me this is actually the last day of summer. So anyway, welcome here. It was a good reminder, though, that living in Edmonton, it's sort of the complete package, right? You have to embrace the inclement weather, but at the same time also celebrate living in a community where we do all come together. Persons on the spectrum, parents, teachers, clinicians, people involved in administrative decision making, all out of a common goal of supporting people living on the spectrum and helping them live full lives and achieve their dreams. And that's very much what today is all about. So today is hosted by the Autism Research Center, which is really a joint partnership between the university and Alberta Health Services. My role is supported by the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation, chair in autism, and it's been great having an opportunity to work with a wonderful team. I'll do proper thank yous at the end, but I just want to acknowledge the outstanding work of the team. The picture was circulating sort of on the slides initially, and I'll introduce everyone and provide the names sort of towards the end, but you'll meet many of them. You've met Sana, who's MC, Laurie Sacre and Olivia Conlon have been leading the charge, and you'll meet the other players throughout the day. I want to acknowledge their wonderful efforts. We actually have 130 people registered to attend the conference today, which is actually more than twice the number in any previous year. So that's absolutely remarkable. And again, sort of speaks to your interest and commitment and taking a day out of your busy lives to join this discussion and think about the needs of people living on the spectrum. So as Sana said, I'll start out with a bit of an update on the research that our center is involved in today. Also, I'd acknowledge that I have been co-director of the center. The other co-director, Joanne Volden, was a professor in the university, a speech and language scientist, and actually retired this spring and was actually really instrumental in the development of the center and bringing her unique perspective about supporting function and opportunity for people with autism. So I really do want to acknowledge her contributions today. I'll give my talk, then there will be a panel discussion focused on supporting mental health, a break where there'll be a chance to have more coffee and snacks, some terrific resources and people manning the desks out there, so I hope you have a chance to see who's here today. After the break, there'll be a session on supporting success in the school system, particularly around learning and attention. Then we invite you all to stay for lunch and continue to chat and speak with people manning the desks, and then we'll wrap up after lunch. Okay, so thanks again for being here. So with no further ado, I'll sort of jump into a bit of an update of the research that our center's been involved in. So again, here is our wonderful team, and we all welcome you to this conference today. I'll talk a little bit about three of the projects that our team is working on. These projects share in common that we're one side of a number across Canada, and in some cases across North America. And in many respects, sort of doing sort of important work that's really leading these international studies. The first project is the infant sibling study. The second is a project called Pathways in Autism, where we're studying the development of children and youth with autism throughout childhood. The third is the Autism Treatment Network, which focuses on healthcare for children and youth with autism. And I'll also talk about some other projects and other exciting initiatives that are represented here today. So as I mentioned, the infant sibling study, which some of you in the crowd may have met us because of your interest and participation in this project, focuses on the early development of younger siblings of children with autism. Because autism is a condition that can run in families, there's higher risk for younger siblings, and it's given us a unique opportunity to monitor their development and to observe sort of among the earliest signs as they emerge sort of during early childhood. As part of this project, our current support has allowed us to move from simply describing those early signs to thinking about what we can offer to children and families in terms of intervention. And building on some important work by our colleagues in Toronto and Halifax, we've been working on a toddler intervention model called the Social ABCs, and the particular focus of this project is actually looking at whether this intervention can be further enhanced by some targeted training, which I'll talk a little bit more about, essentially helping the infants be more flexible in their ability to shift attention, and that maybe that would allow them to be more flexible in shifting attention in their day-to-day lives and sort of more fully benefit from their social experiences. We also have a sub-project within this infant study on parent perspectives, essentially asking parents who've participated in the study previously, what was it like actually having your infant monitored, and what are your preferences around broaching concerns as they emerge? One of the surprising aspects of this infant research is that sometimes the signs of autism emerge sort of later in infancy. So whereas I think at the outset we assumed that if we could work with infants early enough that the signs of autism might be obvious even in 6-month-olds, what we found, and is really very much reinforced by parents' previous descriptions of their child's development, is that often those earliest signs emerge later in that first year of life or even into the second year. So it's a unique experience as a research participant, because for a lot of these parents, they sign on with infants that there's a sense that they're very socially engaged, there really aren't any concerns, and then the concerns might emerge in the course of the study, sort of after they consented to be part of it. And that can be a very unique experience, sort of in receiving that type of information in a research context rather than in a clinic. I also want to acknowledge that we're a site of a US-based neuroimaging study. So there are 4 sites in the US that we work with where these younger siblings are actually having brain imaging. They have magnetic resonance imaging to monitor their early brain development. And there's been actually some very interesting findings from that there may be subtle brain development differences that even precede overt behavioral signs, and raises a kind of interesting but challenging dilemma about the possibility of identifying infants at higher risk even before they develop behavioral signs, and what are the implications in terms of how that information is shared with parents, and what can we offer for them before some of the behaviors emerge. I'll highlight some of the behavioral findings, some of the findings that are more directly related to the work that we're doing here in Edmonton. So the first, and I want to acknowledge that a number of these papers are described in the newsletter, and I want to thank Lori and the research staff for coming up with summaries of these studies that hopefully will be that one doesn't have to kind of have a PhD in psychology to decipher the technical language, but rather focuses on the essential findings. So the first finding related to early communication development. So we have a colleague in Halifax that looked very closely at videos of these infants being seen at their appointments and sort of tracked their use of joint attention behaviors. So that is their use of eye gaze and other forms of communication to connect with parents and others through infancy and childhood. And what she found is that the differences emerged in the first year of life, and that the progressive differences that were seen over the first couple of years really had their origins symptoms even at 6 months. And although we've assessed joint attention using standardized measures before, her careful observation on these videos found that there were subtle differences in frequency, variety, as well as the quality of these early communication behaviors that could identify some of these very young infants likely to develop a diagnosis of autism. The second finding relates to attention and early emotion regulation, and was very much the inspiration for the attention training that we're now combining with our social ABCs intervention. Essentially, we have infants with a parent, often their mom, sit in front of a computer screen, and we show an image and wait for them to sort of show an interest and orient to that image. And then we show them a second image. And what we're looking at is whether infants are able to sort of stop looking at their first image and then sort of shift their attention and look at their second. And it's sort of this measure of kind of flexibility, flexibility in attention that may relate to flexibility in thinking and flexibility in routines and interests later in childhood. And in this project, our colleague found that infants who had a hard time unsticking their attention from that first image to move over to the second were those infants who were most likely to develop autism. And interestingly, they were the same infants who also had difficulties with emotion regulation in infancy and later in toddlerhood. So having difficulty being consoled, for instance, if they were distressed. And again, it makes some sense if we think about, sort of being able to settle ourselves, be able to come down from intense emotion does partly relate to sort of flexibility, to be able to kind of move on. So it reinforced this idea that if we can actually help infants become more flexible in their attention by directly kind of helping them learn through games, that perhaps they'll be more able to manage their emotions and at the same time be more receptive to social learning. And finally, through our project, for years we've used an observational assessment to characterize some of the early behavioral signs. But we've always recognized that all the measures really that we use in these infant studies are very much inspired by the stories of parents and how parents for years have described the early development of their children. So we adapted our observational tool essentially to be a parent questionnaire and then asked parents to complete it starting at 6 months of age. This data sat in our files for years, and Lori, God bless her, went through about a decade of data and looked at sort of how those parent reports kind of related to predicting risk of autism. And as it turns out, the parent reports, and again, it probably won't surprise anyone in the room, if anything, were more accurate, or at least very early in life, we're picking up on some subtle differences that our brief observational assessments weren't, particularly at 6 and 9 months, sort of slight differences in sensory interests and play. And it really raises this prospects of pushing the envelope around early screening for autism to the first year of life. And we're in the process of establishing a partnership with a research network that is based in community pediatricians' offices to look at whether we could actually collect this type of information, not just from families who have a younger sibling in their family, but actually to all families who don't necessarily have a family history of autism, and whether this could improve early detection. So the next broad project is Pathways in Autism. So essentially this is a study of early development in autism. We work with 4 other sites across Canada, from Halifax to British Columbia. And very much the focus is on learning, physical, emotional health, and the multiple layers of factors that might influence how children and youth with autism do over time. Factors within the child, within the family, and within the broader community. Currently, we've been working with this group of children diagnosed in the preschool years, now all the way into high school, and starting to work with these young teens and looking how they're doing now. And as part of that, we're adding a study of lived experience, essentially sitting down and interviewing those teens and their parents to understand what their lives are like, how they think about the future, and sort of, how autism kind of intersects with other aspects of their identity. Some of the important key findings. So I talked a little bit about emotional regulation early in childhood. We have there's a major focus sort of later today on mental health and well-being in children with autism. And working with a large group of children with autism, there was an opportunity to see how these differences developed over time. So essentially what we found is that emotional and behavioral symptoms have their roots early in preschool and are actually sort of remarkably stable or tenacious kind of through childhood and adolescence. And it's interesting that those challenges occur across the spectrum and were not particularly correlated with severity of autism symptoms or intellectual functioning. So whether the child was nonverbal and significantly cognitively challenged or had a lot of academic and language strengths, they were equally susceptible to these kinds of emotional and behavioral challenges. What was related it were very much the kinds of factors that relate to emotional and behavioral symptoms in the broader community. So gender, so there were boys were more likely to have attentional or kind of more overt behavioral challenges, and girls were more likely to have depression or anxious symptoms. And likewise, sort of family demographic factors, including income, also related to likelihood of those symptoms. And our understanding of the broader community that may be a complex dynamic, but it could include sort of access to supports for those sorts of symptoms. So it really emphasizes that there's a certain universality to this, to susceptibility to emotional and behavioral symptoms, and individuals with autism share a lot with their similar age peers in terms of what those risk factors might be. The second study is a study of language and storytelling abilities, essentially recognizing that there are many students with autism who on standardized language testing have good vocabulary, have good grammar skills, but things sort of fall apart when it comes to a narrative. So writing an essay, telling a story, kind of getting their thoughts on paper, but even telling a story orally. Because, as you know, there's sort of kind of a lot of factors that go into sort of telling a story. So Joanne, who led this work, and actually Olivia, who you'll meet later today, continues to working on this work and looking at differences between boys and girls in their narrative, and actually has a poster outside sort of on this, essentially sort of focused on characterizing a measure called the ERNI, or the Expression, Reception, and Recall of Narrative Instrument, and essentially found that this instrument was helpful in detecting the subtle challenges that may be present, but that may have actually very significant functional impact in the classroom for children who are working on language arts, and despite their strong vocabulary, is kind of struggling with writing stories, and provides an opportunity to identify students who on the surface may be kind of functioning within that average range of very basic testing, but still in need of support. And then finally, we have a paper coming out in the next few months looking at age of diagnosis and factors influencing age of diagnosis. And it's quite sobering. We would like to think that we're making a lot of progress in terms of identifying early signs and working with community professionals to foster earlier diagnosis. But the truth is, even in this research-intensive sample, the average age of diagnosis was over the age of 3. Sort of across our 5 sites, it was between just over 3 and 3.5. Now, that doesn't sound maybe so old, but keep in mind that this was a study of preschoolers. So to actually get into the study, you couldn't be any older than 5 years old. So even among a preschool group, the distribution was skewed towards older children. And there were definitely factors that influence age of diagnosis, particularly symptom severity and language and intellectual abilities. So we may be making some progress in identifying autism early for children with more severe presentations, children who are more delayed, but the children with more subtle presentations or stronger language abilities continue to fly under the radar. So it's very much a double-edged sword that those kids may sort of come into the diagnosis sort of with more foundational skills, but are less likely to be identified and therefore benefit from early intervention. And we still have a lot of work to do to identify kids across the spectrum early in life. I mentioned the Autism Treatment Network. So again, this is a partnership with Autism Speaks and a number of sites across North America focused on healthcare. One of the innovations of this network and an initiative that we've had a chance to participate in focuses on working with community physicians and building capacity for better medical follow-up. So it's a model that was developed in New Mexico, actually by a gastroenterologist who found that he had a lot of patients with chronic hepatitis that were not getting good care because they had to drive 100 miles into the clinic and were missing appointments and kind of falling between the cracks. And he essentially developed this telehealth-based program where physicians would kind of sign on over their lunch hour, discuss cases, and have sort of brief presentations. And it's very effective for that patient population, and now has been extended to a number of other groups, now including children with autism. So we're now part of this. So every other Thursday, we sort of get on the line, sort of over telehealth, kind of video conferencing with a group of physicians all across Alberta. So all the way up to Fort McMurray. There's one particular pediatrician who works in Wetaskiwin with the First Nations communities, and they present among the most challenging clinical scenarios that you could imagine. And we work through them together. And increasingly over time, the other participants contribute to the discussion and management of those cases, and in doing so become more expert and more confident in managing their own patients. And previous research on this model has showed that the care does improve and the patient and the physicians feel more confident about managing. And one exciting extension, which we're hoping to pursue as well in Edmonton, is could this teaching model help community physicians learn a bit more about diagnostic assessment as well? And could we sort of build community capacity so that we don't have this bottleneck of all children sort of needing a diagnosis, needing to come to a highly specialized center? So certainly stay tuned on that. So in terms of some other exciting initiatives, there is now a national autism surveillance system. For years we've had to rely on data from the US in terms of estimating how common autism was, that 1 in 68 figure that comes from the US. So just recently there was the publication of the first Canadian multi-province report. The link is here, and happy to make this available. So there are currently 6 provinces and territories participating. Unfortunately, Alberta is not one of them, but we're hoping that will change in the next year or so. I've actually moved into kind of a chair role with that advisory committee, and the chief epidemiologist has a 14-year-old daughter with autism and is incredibly passionate about this work, and I really do see this kind of growing across the country. Jessica Bryan, who leads the Social ABC's work, and I are also working with the Canadian Pediatric Society to establish national standards around autism assessment, kind of drawing from lessons with our infant study as well as the experience of colleagues across the country, again with the goal of making autism diagnosis more accessible and building capacity among community pediatricians to provide good medical follow-up. There is excellent provincial collaboration. There is a new organization called the Alberta Autism Alliance that was spearheaded initially by Autism Alberta and Autism Calgary, but now has a strong Edmonton representation as well. And they're holding their first sort of conference in Calgary, and hopefully it'll kind of move between Calgary and other places, including Edmonton, over the years. But this is coming up in a few weeks on October 15th. There's a very nominal registration cost, like $10, and there'll be some panels really focused on sort of kind of advancing standards of autism care across the province, and providing a kind of a provincial advocacy platform for these important issues like assessment and mental health and many of the things we'll be talking about today. And then there are other terrific research studies that you'll hear about today and are also represented outside in the hall, including a focus on transition to adult health services, social participation, and Dr. Brown's study of kind of learning and math, which you'll hear about more today. Sorry to sort of keep going on. This is why I'm not taking questions today, because people who have been in with me in the clinic know that just once I get going, it's kind of hard to stop. But only because this work we find so exciting, and we're so happy to be able to share it with you. So again, to briefly acknowledge our funders, including the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation, which helps us do this work and sort of makes it a very exciting time to look forward to subsequent research efforts. So with that, thank you for your interest and attention. If you have questions about any of these studies, please feel free to approach me during the breaks throughout the day. And with that, I think, am I going to welcome Sana back to the stage, to the podium, and something special now too, right? Okay, thank you.